Welcome to FOS. In this community, we are creating space where each person can find hope, beauty, and purpose in the story of Jesus. A community where we are reduced to love as we begin reimagining faith together. Now, our series we've been going through, A Cloud of Ancestors, is an active practice of reimagining faith because we are looking through Scripture to find our true ancestors, those who stood with the discounted and the powerless, in order to challenge and shame the systems which fight to keep us separated from each other. Their stories offer us hope that tomorrow doesn't need to be a predictable repetition of today. And now I know that as we look through ancestors, just like when we look through our actual family lines, we have some that embarrass us and some that bring us pride and honor. In this series, we're going to try to look for the ones who almost go forgotten. They neither bring us great pride or bring us lower. We're going to look for the voices that critique things without us knowing. So sitting with the great cloud of ancestors, or the inherited stories which shape our lives, challenge us to see which people have had to pay for the stability. Often, when we think of our ancestors, our imaginations are drawn towards main characters, heroes, kings, and prophets. We begin with the powerful or the centered, probably because they're the ones who paid for the story to be written, but also because they're the ones who wrote the history, so their names are center stage. Yet, they seldom pay the price for stability themselves. That's left to other people. As I was working through Judges 11 to highlight a seldom heard ancestor's voice, I found my mind kept drifting back to a class Britt and I took when we were first married. It was a class to help newlyweds develop a stable narrative to govern their homes. It talked about a woman's brain and a man's brain. They said women's brain were chaotic, connected to everything, where man thought in silos and were logical. It talked of common missteps which bred conflict. Now, the class was called Laugh Your Way to Benevolent Misogyny. Sorry, that might have been my own interpretation of it because I really didn't like it. But its real title was Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage. And they said that men were focused on big pictures, on work and provision. So it's only natural for them to overlook the house that he is rightly the divine head of. Therefore, if the woman wants her husband to take responsibility at the home he governs, then she needs to reward his actions. Anytime she sees him doing housework unasked, taking ownership of the home they both live in, she should give him a blowjob. At least that's what the biblical marriage class recommended, that the wife learns how to commodify her body and her sexuality in order to trade it for services in the home. She was to please him while receiving nothing in return, to honor the fact that the man lowered himself, decided to become aware that he needed to share responsibility for the home they both lived in. The room filled with male laughters and elbowing, and women remained silent. As I raised my hand, I said, doesn't this teach women that they should pay for needs with sex? Like, how is this any different than prostitution? It's turning our bodies and our sex into a commodity of trade. I said, why don't we reverse it then and tell the men here to perform fellatio without receiving anything back, to honor the consistent work of women? Suddenly, the men got awkwardly silent, and the women spoke up. It turns out that they didn't appreciate and they did not desire to pay men to grow up and to be mature. They did not want to trade themselves to fill the lack in the narrative with their bodies. Now, just so I don't sound too golden, I did have that one prolific moment, that one good question. But then I proceeded when a woman disagreed with me and said, that's not too bad. I'd rather the laundry get done. I may have started mansplaining women gender roles and recommending which feminist she should read. So I started really well, but then, I meet it. But they were good book references, so what can I do? Nevertheless, this is why, as we look for ancestors, we need to trace lines of power. Because unless they become explicit rather than implied, unless they become visible rather than overlooked, we will never witness who pays for a stable home. And far too often, it is the wives and the daughters who have to vouchsafe the stability, the ego, and the honor of men. So, as Nate Piles says, who is a pastor in America, to understand racism, you need to understand power dynamics. To understand sexism, you need to understand power dynamics. To understand poverty, you need to understand power dynamics. To understand power dynamics, you need to listen and believe the stories of the powerless, because they're the ones who always pay the price. So let us walk through Judges 11 with this in mind, so that we can discover in our ancestors' voices a way to critique and move forward. See, Judges 11 is the story of Jephthah, a judge who is a marginalized son, looking enough like power to pass as one of them when the village had need. It opens with he is a valiant warrior and head of an illegitimate house. But because he could fight, he was offered a seat at the table. So Judges 11 says, now Jephthah the Gileadite was the son of a whore, but Gilead, the main patriarch, had fathered him. Son of a whore removes him from the patriarchal systems governing the tribe because it removes him from legitimate power. They traced power through the licit, through the legal, through the proper wives of the head male or the chieftain. It was assumed that any chieftain, any person in power, would have many illicit conquests, many other women. So it's not a shame unto him that he had a prostitute on the side that he used. But the progeny of such things were cut off from the tribe, from the power, from the resources. Only legitimate heirs mattered. But trouble came, and the good people who drove him out of town have need, so his place is reconsidered. It says in verse 5, when the Amorites attacked, the elders of the community gatekeepers sought him out and offered him a position. Come, be our leader so that we can fight. But Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, did you not hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you're in trouble? But even after a lifetime spent as a whore's son, he is seduced by the offer to be included in their systems of power. He is moved by a chance of taking a seat at the table, at their table, which excluded him before. Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and leader over them. Then Jephthah goes to meet with the Ammonite king, and he retells the story of divine conquest. Because all the people of this time period, all the people in the tribe knew that land, power, and position were divinely bestowed. And he goes on in verse 23 to say, the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven out the Amorites, the ones who had this land before, from his people Israel. So should you, the Ammonites, possess it. Do you not possess what Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess? So whatever the Lord our God has dispossessed for us, we will possess. Obviously, there's disagreement or there wouldn't be a good story. And before they're going to go to war, Jephthah makes a vow to God. If you really hand the Amorites over to me, if you let me slaughter and kill the enemies of my tribe, then whoever is the first to come through the doors of my house to meet me when I return safely from war, he will belong to the Lord, and I will offer him up as a burnt sacrifice. Whoever comes, he will be sacrificed for my successful rise to power. Whoever comes is expendable. This act was an act of God, elders, and the newly included to power Jephthah. They were okay with the necessary sacrifice of those beneath them to solidify their position. He would expect an enslaved person to rush out to greet him because usually you had a servant who watched for the master's return. Someone who would have been beneath him even when he was just the fatherless son of a whore rather than a chieftain. But it was his only child, a nameless daughter, who ran out to him first. and the narrative goes out of its way to mark her out as the perfect scapegoat. She is a virgin who values an oath to God over her own life. She accepts Jephthah's words because when she comes out, he goes, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought disaster on me." No, not my vow has brought disaster, not my action, not my capriciousness. You have done this. She will pay the price of Jephthah's inclusion and rise to power. And the narrative, Jephthah says, this is your fault, because if you did not come, if you did not rush, if you didn't do these invisible hands of God to bring you out, I wouldn't have to kill you. And all would go as planned, save for our ancestors, the scribes and the daughters of Israel, who gave us the gift of shaming power by creating a yearly festival dedicated to a nameless daughter. Judges 11:40, which ends the whole story, has a throwaway line almost. It just suddenly says, every year Israelite women commemorate the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, for 4 days. Now why? She's already dead. She has been burned alive, so what good could it do? It was a yearly tableau, a graphic representation of what the elders will do to the powerless to keep things as they are. It was a yearly reminder to all those who sit comfortably around the table of the lives that they willingly destroy to keep power. The elders and gatekeepers knew the illegitimate son, in times of need, looked enough like them, enough like their style of power, to receive a place at the table without upsetting or turning over the table. Because Jephthah just took his position at the top of the pyramid. He didn't say, maybe as my experience of being outcast, being outside, we should reset it. Just like the women of Israel knew those without power, like his nameless daughter, would always fill in the debt to keep those systems in place. They would always be sacrificed for the reputation of those sitting around the table. So to honor their sister and protest their daughters having to become sacrifices, the women retold the story of necessary violence, patriarchal shortcomings, and the daughters who still pay the cost of men's social honor. 4 days a year, they shame those comfortable with how things are. However, it did not need to go this way. Jephthah had to break Torah law, but he chose which law to break. Because there was a law that forbid this kind of sacrifice to God. And there was a law about breaking your vow to God, but only one of those would destroy your reputation. To break the vow means he might suffer the wrath of God. He broke it. He'd have to pay something, him personally. To break the vow means his position that he just claimed is suspect. It's threatened, because how do we allow you to be our champion when you just broke your word to God? You're an oath breaker. He had a choice: to save a life or to keep Torah, to value his daughter or protect his reputation. He chose poorly, but the response of the women around him, I believe, created the path for later writings to draft a new law. The Talmud tells us, if you must break commandments to save a life, do so. Hillel the elder, which would be coming towards the 1st century, tells us that he was around for Sabbath and a man fell asleep on one of the roofs when it started snowing. Sabbath was edging closer, so he had a choice. Does he climb up to the top of the house, break Sabbath law, and bring him down because he's sleeping in the snow? He says yes. He climbs up, brings him down, bathes him, works, dresses him, gets him warm again. And the gentleman says, you broke Sabbath to save me. And Hillel's response was, your life is worth desecrating the Sabbath for. And then some later Talmud writers go even farther and say, even if you suspect danger, suspect imminent demise, and are wrong, no guilt comes to you. Because it is better that you risk to save a life than you keep the laws. Even if you're wrong, they said, go and do. Now, their voices changed the future discourse. The scribes, the men who were hired by power to tell the official story, chose to stand with the daughters of Israel, to add their subversive act which shames the system that makes women expendable, forever turning Jephthah's story of claiming power into the foolish act destroying his daughter. The women shamed power by standing with their unnamed sister. The scribes became allies by siding with their true ancestors and making sure their defiant act carried forward 3,000 years to remind us today about the gift of shaming power and the power of solidarity. Jephthah's nameless daughter would remain just a perfect sacrifice to his honor, just a scapegoat, without her sisters keeping the story living as they shamed the chieftains 4 days every year. The daughters of Israel's protest would only affect their time, their particular tribe, unless the scribes of the court stood with them to become allies and add their song as protest to the last word of Jephthah's story. A whore's son turned chieftain, a chieftain who would sacrifice others to retain position instead of his own honor, gave light through the protests of the women and the allies of the scribes to say a new way could go forward to where a new law was written. We will always break Torah law. We'll always break biblical law if it means to save a life. So the scribes of Judges 11 and the women who refuse to remain silent offer us the gift of shaming and solidarity. Now, whose stories are we allowing to become our ancestors? Are they all stories of the strong? Or will we allow the gift of shame to remind us of the daughters who pay the price of saving face?